September 7th, 1940, 5:20 in the evening, East End, London. Mary Thompson heard the air raid sirens begin their rising wail at exactly 5:25 in the afternoon. Early for a raid, though raids had been coming daily. Since the Luftwaffe had shifted from attacking RAF airfields to bombing cities, she was hanging, washing in the small yard behind her row house in Stepney, when the sound began, that eerie, mechanical howl that had become the voice of autumn. 1940, her first thought, was for her daughters, Beatrice, age 8, and Margaret, age 5, playing in the front street with neighborhood children. Her second thought was the shelter. They had perhaps minutes before the bombers arrived. She called the girls inside with practiced calm, the kind of deliberate composure that had become standard among London mothers who refused to transmit their fear to children. "Come along, darlings. Shelter time. Bring your dolls." The Anderson shelter at the end of the garden was a corrugated steel structure half buried in the ground, damp and cramped, but designed to withstand near misses from high explosive bombs. Mary had made it as comfortable as possible. Blankets, a small oil lamp, a tin of biscuits, books for the children, knitting for herself. The routine was practiced now. Shoes on, coats grabbed, dolls and books collected. Down the garden path into the shelter. Pull the door shut. Wait! The bombers came at sunset. Over 300 Luftwaffe aircraft in formation, their engines a sustained mechanical thunder that made the ground vibrate. Mary sat in the shelter with her daughters pressed against her sides, listening to the whistle of falling bombs growing closer, the crump of explosions that started in the distance and walked steadily nearer, like footsteps of approaching giants. The first bomb that landed close enough to matter hit perhaps 2 streets away. The explosion was a physical force that compressed the air and made her ears pop. The shelter shook. Dirt rained from the corrugated ceiling. Beatrice whimpered. Margaret clutched her doll tighter. Mary began singing softly, steadily, an old music hall song about summer by the seaside. And after a moment, the girls joined in. Their voices were thin against the thunder of the bombardment, but they sang anyway. The bombing continued for hours. Explosions, fire, the scream of aircraft engines, the crack of anti-aircraft guns, the whistle of incendiaries. Mary sang with her daughters, knitted by lamplight when they fell asleep, and maintained the calm demeanor that was becoming the default setting for British civilians under bombardment. Fear acknowledged but not displayed. Terror recognized but not permitted to dominate. The deliberate choice to carry on, because carrying on was what one did. When the all-clear sounded at dawn, Mary emerged from the shelter to find her street transformed. 3 houses down the road had been reduced to smoking rubble. The corner shop where she bought milk had lost its entire front wall. Fire still burned in the distance, sending smoke across the sunrise. But her own house stood intact, windows blown out, roof tiles scattered, but structurally sound. She made tea, put on the wireless for news, got the girls washed and dressed. They had breakfast, tinned sardines on toast, the last of the bread, while listening to the BBC announcer calmly reporting on the previous night's raids. Then Mary walked her daughters to school, stepping around debris and broken glass, nodding to neighbors doing the same, all of them maintaining the fiction that this was normal morning routine rather than the aftermath of the apocalypse. At the school gates, the headmistress stood checking off children's names, her hair slightly disheveled, but her bearing absolutely correct. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. Good morning, girls. Classes begin at 9 seconds as usual." Mary returned home, swept the glass from her floors, covered the blown-out windows with cardboard and tape, and went to her job at the munitions factory. The morning shift started at 8 hills. She was 3 minutes late. The bus had been diverted around bomb damage, but she was there, along with every other woman on her shift, all of them tired and frightened, but present, doing the work that needed doing. This was the first night of what would become 57 consecutive nights of bombing. The Blitz had begun, and London would not break. The Luftwaffe's strategy for breaking Britain was straightforward, and had worked elsewhere. Systematic bombing of cities to destroy civilian morale, force population panic, create political pressure for government surrender. The theory was sound, proven in Poland and France. Aerial bombardment created terror among civilian populations. Cities under sustained bombing experienced psychological collapse. Panic, mass flight, breakdown of civil order, political pressure on governments to capitulate rather than watch their populations suffer. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, was confident. "The Führer has ordered me to destroy London. I shall reduce it to ashes. The British will beg for terms within weeks." The operational plan reflected this confidence. Beginning September 7th, hundreds of bombers would strike London nightly. Targets included docks, factories, transportation hubs, and residential areas. High explosive bombs would destroy buildings. Incendiaries would start uncontrollable fires. The sustained campaign would create cascading psychological effect. Sleeplessness, fear, loss of homes, disruption of services, until British will to resist collapsed. German intelligence assessments predicted British morale would crack within 2 to 3 weeks of sustained bombing. Historical precedent supported this timeline. No city had endured prolonged aerial bombardment without experiencing population panic and political collapse. London would be no different. The first night's raids involved over 300 bombers dropping hundreds of tons of high explosives and incendiaries on East London. The docks burned. Residential areas were devastated. Casualties exceeded 400 killed and over 1,300 wounded in a single night. The destruction exceeded anything London had experienced. German pilots returning from the raid reported massive fires visible from the French coast. Entire districts burning, obvious and extensive damage. The raids had achieved tactical objectives. Now they waited for the psychological collapse that would follow. It never came. The morning after the first major raid, London did something the German strategists had not anticipated. It carried on. Buses resumed service on diverted routes around bomb damage. Underground trains ran on modified schedules. Workers who'd lost homes overnight still reported to factories. Shops that could open did so, even if their windows were blown out. Schools held classes in buildings still standing, combining classes whose schools had been destroyed. The response was not heroic defiance. It was practical stubbornness. Work needed doing. Children needed education. Life required continuation. So Londoners continued it with the same calm determination they'd apply to bad weather or any other inconvenience that couldn't be avoided but could be endured. Winston Churchill's government had prepared for this moment. Civil defense organizations established during the pre-war years activated immediately. Air raid wardens directed people to shelters. Fire brigades fought blazes with systematic efficiency. Rescue teams pulled survivors from rubble. Medical services treated casualties. The machinery of civil defense functioned as designed, not perfectly, but adequately, maintaining order in circumstances designed to create chaos. The underground railway system became a mass shelter network. Over 100,000 people bedded down nightly on station platforms, creating improvised communities in the tunnels. The government had initially resisted using underground stations as shelters. Concerns about hygiene, psychological dependency, difficulty getting people to leave. But public pressure and practical necessity won out. The tubes became London's bedroom during the Blitz. The scenes in the underground would have shocked German planners expecting panic. Families established regular sleeping spots. People brought bedding, books, knitting, playing cards. Children did homework by lamplight. Adults sang popular songs, told jokes, maintained social routines in the most abnormal of circumstances. The British talent for queuing, forming orderly lines, extended to shelter access. People waited patiently for their turn to descend to safety. No pushing, no panic, just disciplined patience. Mary Thompson and her daughters joined this nightly migration after the third raid damaged their house beyond comfortable habitation. They'd queue at Stepney Green Station around 6 in the evening, descend to the platform, claim their regular spot, third alcove from the stairs, left side, and settle in for the night. Beatrice would read. Margaret would play quietly with her doll. Mary would knit socks for soldiers while listening to other families' conversations, the low murmur of people making the best of a bad situation. "It's not so terrible," Mary told her daughters. "Rather like camping, isn't it? An adventure underground." The girls accepted this fiction because their mother presented it calmly. If Mom said it was an adventure, then it was an adventure, even with bombs falling overhead and the distant rumble of explosions, making the platform tremble. Bombing continued without interruption from September 7th through November 2nd, 1940, 57 consecutive nights of raids. The pattern became routine: sirens in early evening, population movement to shelters, bombers arriving at dusk, hours of bombardment through the night, all clear at dawn, population emerging to assess damage, work crews clearing debris, fires being fought, casualties being treated, then the daily activities, work, school, shopping, living, conducted in daylight before the cycle began again at evening. The targets varied, but the intensity remained constant. One night the docks, another night the city financial district, sometimes the West End, often the East End, where working-class families lived in dense row housing particularly vulnerable to fire. The Luftwaffe dropped high-explosive bombs to destroy buildings and create rubble, then incendiaries to start fires in the wreckage. The combination was designed to overwhelm firefighting capacity and create firestorms. London burned. Night after night, vast sections of the city were illuminated by flames visible for miles. The German bomber crews could navigate by the fires from previous raids. Pilots reported seeing London from the French coast, a red glow on the northern horizon, marking a city being systematically destroyed. But the city did not break. The casualty statistics documented the human cost. By the end of 1940, over 13,000 Londoners had been killed in the bombing. Over 18,000 seriously wounded. Hundreds of thousands had lost homes. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. The material damage was staggering. Homes, factories, historic buildings, infrastructure all suffering extensive destruction. Yet the psychological collapse the Germans expected never materialized. Workers whose homes had been bombed still reported to factories. Children whose schools had been destroyed attended makeshift classes in church halls. Families who'd lost everything maintained routines with whatever they had left. The stubborn British refusal to acknowledge. Defeat expressed itself in small daily acts of normalcy, maintained against all logic. The heroism of the Blitz was not dramatic. It was domestic. It was mothers like Mary Thompson singing to their children in shelters while bombs fell overhead. It was workers showing up to factories after sleepless nights in the underground. It was shopkeepers opening damaged shops because customers needed goods. It was teachers holding classes in buildings with windows blown out. It was the steady, undramatic continuation of life in circumstances designed to make life impossible. The milkman still delivered. The postman still made his rounds, even when half the addresses on his route no longer existed. Bus drivers navigated around fresh bomb craters. Policemen directed traffic through streets littered with debris. These were not grand gestures, but small insistences that normal life would continue despite extraordinary circumstances. The humor helped. British humor, dry and understated, became a psychological defense mechanism. A shop whose front had been blown out displayed a sign, "More open than usual." A pub hit by incendiary bombs advertised, "Our drinks are still on fire." A bombed-out church posted a notice. Services as usual. In the crypt. This refusal to treat catastrophe as catastrophe, this deliberate decision to respond to apocalyptic bombing with tea and humor, was psychologically devastating to German assumptions. The Luftwaffe could destroy buildings, but couldn't destroy the spirit that responded to destruction with jokes. Churchill understood this instinctively. His wartime broadcasts maintained a calm, firm tone that acknowledged difficulty while expressing absolute confidence in ultimate victory. He visited bombed areas personally, walking through rubble in his Homburg hat and bow tie, stopping to speak with rescue workers and survivors, his presence communicating that leadership remained present and engaged. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be," he told Parliament before the Blitz began. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." This wasn't rhetoric. It was a statement of national intention. Britain would endure. London would endure. The bombs could kill people, destroy homes, burn districts. They could not force surrender because surrender was simply not among the options the British were willing to consider. For Luftwaffe pilots flying nightly missions over London, the British response was incomprehensible. They'd been told British morale would collapse. They'd seen it work elsewhere. Cities bombed into submission, populations panicked into demanding surrender, governments forced to capitulate by their own terrified citizens. The formula was proven. Applied to London with massive force over a sustained period, it should have worked. Instead, night after night, the pilots saw a city that refused to quit functioning. Anti-aircraft fire remained intense. London's defenses were strengthening, not weakening. Searchlights swept the sky with undiminished determination. Fires from previous raids would still be burning, yet new lights showed in windows. Traffic moved in streets. The city clearly continued operating despite accumulated damage. Hauptmann Klaus Fischer flew 34 missions over London during the Blitz. His diary, captured after the war, documented growing bewilderment at British resilience. September 15th. Another night over London. The city burns but never dies. We drop our bombs, see the fires, know we've hit them hard. Return the next night, and they're still there, still fighting, searchlights as bright as ever. How do they maintain this? October 8th. Intelligence reports. British morale remains high. This seems impossible. We've destroyed entire districts, killed thousands. They should be begging for terms. Instead, radio intercepts show normal commercial broadcasts, music programs, comedy shows, as if nothing is happening. October 23rd. Spoke with other crews. Everyone reports the same confusion. We're winning tactically, hitting targets, causing massive damage, but strategically, nothing changes. London doesn't break. Britain doesn't sue for peace. How long can they sustain this? German intelligence reports confirmed the puzzle. British civilian morale remained surprisingly high despite sustained bombing. War production continued at nearly normal levels. Government functioned without apparent disruption. Population showed no signs of panic or demands for surrender. All metrics suggested the bombing campaign was failing to achieve its psychological objectives. Luftwaffe command responded by intensifying raids. If current levels weren't breaking British will, more bombs would. The tonnage increased. The frequency remained unrelenting. More incendiaries, more high explosives, more systematic destruction. London continued burning and continued functioning. The tube stations during the Blitz became a testament to British ability to create order from chaos and community from catastrophe. Over 170,000 people took shelter in underground stations on peak nights. The government had initially tried to keep the tubes operating as transportation, but public pressure and practical necessity turned them into the world's most extensive air raid shelter network. The scenes would have astonished German planners expecting panic. Families established regular sleeping spots, creating informal territorial claims respected by others. People brought bedding, personal items, even small furniture. Platforms became temporary living rooms where families ate dinner, children did homework, adults socialized. The organization was characteristically British, informal but effective. Someone would organize a sing-along. Someone else would ensure elderly residents got spots away from drafts. Children's bedtime routines were maintained underground, just as they'd been maintained above ground. Parents insisting on toothbrushing and story time despite bombs falling overhead. Entertainment appeared spontaneously. Musicians brought instruments. Singers performed. Someone would organize games for children. The ENSA, Entertainment's National Service Association, sent performers to shelter stations. Professional entertainers doing shows on tube platforms for audiences in pajamas and dressing gowns. Mary Thompson's daughters looked forward to shelter nights despite the circumstances. There were other children to play with. Sometimes there'd be singing. The routine became comforting in its familiarity. Same spot, same neighbors, same rituals. Beatrice would read the same book for weeks, rationing pages to make it last. Margaret made friends with another girl who slept nearby, the two of them sharing dolls and stories while their mothers chatted. The hygiene was questionable. Hundreds of people sleeping in enclosed spaces with limited toilet facilities. Disease risk was significant. But the comfort of numbers, the psychological benefit of community, the shared experience of enduring together, these outweighed physical discomfort. By late October, the underground had developed its own culture. Regular residents knew each other. Informal leaders emerged to mediate disputes and organize activities. A social hierarchy established itself, not of class, but of temperament, with the calm and capable naturally assuming responsibility for maintaining order and morale. This was British civilization continuing. Underground, literally maintaining social structures and behavioral norms in bomb shelters, because those structures and norms defined who they were. The bombs could drive them beneath the earth, but couldn't make them abandon civility, humor, or the routines that gave life shape. German strategy assumed a breaking point, some level of destruction and casualties beyond which British morale would collapse. The Luftwaffe kept pushing toward that point. Heavier raids, more incendiaries, systematic targeting of working-class residential areas, where casualties would be highest and political pressure most intense. The theory remained sound. Enough suffering would create irresistible pressure for government to negotiate rather than continue sacrificing civilian lives. November 14, 1940, brought one of the war's most devastating raids, not on London but on Coventry. Over 500 bombers dropped hundreds of tons of ordnance on the industrial city, creating a firestorm that destroyed the medieval city center and killed over 500 people. German propaganda claimed to have invented a new word, Coventrieren, to coventrate, meaning to obliterate a city through aerial bombardment. The raid on Coventry was designed to demonstrate what awaited London if Britain didn't surrender. If a medium-sized city could be essentially destroyed in one night, what would happen when similar intensity was applied to the capital? The British response was characteristic: shock, grief, anger, and continued resistance. Coventry's industrial production resumed within weeks. The population didn't flee or demand surrender. They mourned their dead, cleared the rubble, and carried on. The raid that was supposed to break British will instead hardened it, demonstrating that there was no level of bombing that would force capitulation. German pilots were experiencing their own breaking point, not of morale, but of casualties. British air defenses were improving. Night fighters were becoming more effective. Anti-aircraft fire was more concentrated and accurate. Losses were mounting to levels that made the campaign increasingly costly. The attrition affected both sides. Britain was losing civilians and infrastructure. Germany was losing aircrew and aircraft. But the strategic calculus favored Britain. They were defending their homeland while maintaining industrial production and military capability. Germany was expending resources on a campaign that wasn't achieving its objectives, resources needed for the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. By May 1941, the Blitz was ending, not because Britain had broken, but because Germany was redeploying Luftwaffe assets eastward for Operation Barbarossa. The final major raid came, May 10, 1941. Over 500 bombers hitting London in one of the war's heaviest single attacks. Over 1,400 killed, 1,800 seriously wounded. The House of Commons chamber was destroyed. British Museum damaged. Historic churches reduced to shells. The morning after, Londoners emerged from shelters to assess damage that was catastrophic, even by Blitz standards. Entire districts had been devastated. The casualties were staggering, yet the response was unchanged. Clear the rubble. Fight the fires. Tend the wounded. Carry on. The psychological victory was complete and absolute. Germany had applied sustained aerial bombardment at intensity unprecedented in warfare. They'd killed over 20,000 civilians in London alone, wounded over 25,000 more, destroyed over 1 million homes. By any rational measure, they'd inflicted devastating damage. But they hadn't broken British will. They hadn't forced political pressure for surrender. They hadn't achieved any strategic objective that mattered. Britain remained defiant, functional and increasingly confident that it would outlast whatever Germany could deliver. The statistics told the story of endurance, nights of consecutive bombing, 57 total. Londoners killed, approximately 43,000 homes. Destroyed or damaged, over 1 million British. Morale, unbroken war production. Maintained at adequate levels government function. Continued without significant disruption population flight from London. Minimal. Despite sustained bombing political pressure for surrender, non-existent. These numbers documented that aerial bombing, no matter how sustained or intensive, could not force a modern democracy to surrender if population and government maintained will to resist. The Blitz had tested that will to destruction and found it could not be destroyed. May 11, 1941, dawn after the final major Blitz raid. Mary Thompson emerged from Stepney Green Station with her daughters, both of them carrying their few possessions, walking back toward what remained of their neighborhood. The night had been particularly bad. The worst raid yet, everyone said. The fires were still burning across London, smoke turning sunrise orange. Their street had taken a direct hit during the night. Their house, already damaged from previous raids, was now just rubble. Everything they owned that hadn't been in the shelter or underground was gone, destroyed. Mary stood looking at the debris that had been her home, her daughters pressed against her sides, all three of them exhausted and frightened and homeless. Then she noticed her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, standing in front of her own ruined house, holding a teapot retrieved from the wreckage. "I've managed to find the kettle," Mrs. Patterson called out. "Shall we have a cup of tea?" Mary found herself laughing, not from happiness, but from the sheer British absurdity of it. Their homes were destroyed. Their city was burning. They'd spent the night in hell. And Mrs. Patterson was offering tea. "That would be lovely," Mary replied. "Absolutely lovely." They sat on rubble that had been their front stoops, drinking tea from chipped cups while their children played in the ruins, and rescue workers dug through wreckage looking for survivors. Fire brigade hoses snaked down the street. Wardens checked damaged buildings. An ambulance collected casualties. And two neighbors had tea amid the apocalypse, because having tea was what civilized people did, regardless of circumstances. This was what the Germans had failed to understand and could never defeat. The British weren't maintaining morale through propaganda or forced cheerfulness. They were simply being themselves, practical, stubborn, unimpressed by drama, determined to maintain standards regardless of how absurd those standards might seem when applied to catastrophe. You could bomb their houses into rubble. You could kill their neighbors. You could turn their city into an inferno. But you couldn't make them stop having tea. Couldn't make them abandon humor. Couldn't force them to act as if they'd been defeated when they decided they hadn't been. The Blitz had ended, not because Britain broke, but because Germany gave up trying to break them. The 57 nights of bombing had achieved nothing except proving that British determination was stronger than German bombs, and that determination, expressed in a million small acts of ordinary people maintaining extraordinary calm under impossible circumstances, had won a victory more complete than any military triumph could achieve. Britain had shown the world that free people choosing to resist could outlast tyranny's worst efforts to make them submit. The bombs had fallen. London had burned. Thousands had died. But Britain had never surrendered. Would never surrender. Because surrender simply wasn't among the options British character permitted. And in the end, that stubborn refusal to acknowledge defeat, that determinedly British insistence on carrying on with tea and humor and quiet courage, had proven stronger than everything the Luftwaffe could deliver. The war would continue for 4 more years. But the Blitz had answered the question that mattered most. Could Britain be bombed into submission? The answer, written in fire and blood and rubble and tea and stubborn British refusal to panic, was absolutely not.